FSD beta on Hardware 4 has finally arrived, and I have quite the drive to show you through the hills of Berkeley, California that really push it to its limits. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the overall state of full self-driving, because there's been a lot of news around it lately, and it's kind of in a pretty confusing state right now. Remember the occupancy network, which is how the car detects things that it can't exactly identify and then predicts their movement? It's something we've talked about and tested on numerous occasions by throwing things out in front of the car to see how it reacts, and it's been pretty cool seeing it get better and better over time, but guess what? It is gone. Or how about the framework that was explained during the last AI day that shows how the car figures out the lanes around it, intersections, and other important objects in a scene, and then decides what to control for and what to ignore and how to properly plan its path? Gone. No longer necessary. Tesla is going all in on version 12, aka the nothing but nets version, and it works vastly different than any version before it. Gone are the days of manual human programming for what the vehicles should do in certain scenarios, and it is instead being replaced with something new and mildly terrifying, I may add, generalized artificial intelligence that learns from real-world driving videos. And I'm not kidding on that mildly terrifying part. My profile of the Terminator driving probably isn't too far off at this point. I mean, if one of these things is driving you around while you're in the backseat of your Tesla, is it self-driving? Nothing but the most important questions on this channel. Joking aside, the craziest thing about not only this robot, but version 12 as well, is that they are not being told how to behave more naturally and human-like. They are learning it. Like a baby. Big difference, which has massive implications. Version 12 is a little self-driving baby, which is a thought that keeps me up at night. And a valid question would be, given all this new generalized technology and version 12 seemingly right around the corner, is it even worth it to make videos on version 11 anymore? I'd argue yes, because I think it's important to document what current versions do well at and what they struggle with, which will be pretty interesting to compare to the fully neural-based versions when we finally do get them, because I can almost guarantee you it will not be anywhere close to perfect from the start. But I'll leave that decision up to you. And with that out of the way, let's get into some of the smaller details of full self-driving, specifically on Hardware 4. If you didn't know, Hardware 4 vehicles, which started coming out at the beginning of the year by the way, have been lacking many features. Not only missing the full self-driving beta, but also things like Auto Park and Summon, which are still missing to this day. And when I first got this Hardware 4 Model Y that uses vision only, this is what the Park Assist looked like. Yeah, not great, but I am happy to report that it has gotten much better with the last firmware update that included the full self-driving beta. Speaking of which, Elon sent out a very interesting tweet saying that Hardware 4 vehicles would be lagging behind Hardware 3 for at least another 6 months, which, let's be real, if that's 6 months Elon time, it very well could be much longer. And if that wasn't worrying enough, it sounds like Tesla won't even be able to use the training data from Hardware 3 because of the differences in cameras.
Does the higher resolution pose a challenge with the data set and everything? How do you manage that?
We do have to retrain in order to use the high resolution because of the fact that as photons enter controls out, that photons are different.
And just a couple days later, full self-driving was released on Hardware 4. Yeah, I didn't expect that either. But it sounds like for now, Tesla's focus is on getting Hardware 3 working well, which is a bummer in the short term if you recently got a Hardware 4 car, but it does make sense because not only are they compute restricted on training the AI right now, but there are also a ton more Hardware 3 cars in the fleet collecting the data that the AI craves. But that does beg the question, if they're not using the data from Hardware 4 cars at all yet, how is it possible that it has the beta? Well, I believe we got a hint of that when Hardware 3 cars got a camera upgrade that made the colors look a lot more true to life and closely resemble Hardware 4's colors. And when did this update come out? Just a couple days after FSD beta was released on Hardware 4. Might be a coincidence, or maybe, just maybe, we're seeing something close to what was used to Frankenstein the Hardware 3 data into running on Hardware 4 cars. Or maybe that's just one of them tinfoil hat conspiracies. I know I've been hiding behind this silly helmet since this channel's launch, but I think it's finally time to show you what's underneath. Oh, sorry about that. Looks like I forgot to turn off my VPN just a sec. But before I do, let me tell you about the best VPN out there, private internet access. Virtual private networks route your online traffic through secure tunnels, which helps to protect you from the prying eyes of hackers, internet service providers, and others who view and collect your sensitive data. PIA has been my VPN of choice for years now because of their commitment to privacy and strict no-logging data policies, which have been proven multiple times in court. They have over 30 million downloads and are completely open source, meaning you can view the actual source code for yourself and even use custom scripts to do things like port forwarding and DNS customization, which really opens up the possibilities and use cases. They have a world-class server infrastructure, which enables you to spoof your geolocation to one of 84 countries and all 50 US states, which unlocks region lock content on all major streaming services and can even help with getting you a better deal on things like clothes, flights, and games. By using my special link in the description, you can get 83% off and 4 months free, which comes out to just over $2 a month. A great deal for the features you're getting here. And best of all, you can now use a single subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices simultaneously. They have support staff available 24/7 and a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can give it a try with confidence. Thanks again to PIA for sponsoring my videos. To start, I must say it's doing a really nice job visualizing where we are in this parking space. The vision-only park assist isn't the most accurate sometimes, but does seem to be improving even since the short time I've owned this car. I did have some loose objects that you can probably hear in my trunk, but the car is actually doing a pretty good job slowing down for these speed bumps, despite the noises it's making. Although I do typically start out my drives in parking lots like this, I want to reiterate that version 11 is not exactly designed for this quite yet. Don't get me wrong, it is able to handle most situations, like up here where it yields for the pedestrians coming from the right and also waits for the people walking from the left, but does so just a bit awkwardly and uses some harsh steering and braking inputs. These later versions of the full self-driving beta are pretty smoothed out now compared to earlier versions, especially on city streets, but these parking lots can still make it feel just a bit squirrely. Good job not overreacting for the other pedestrians walking around, and then a car pulls out from the left here, which freaks the beta out a little bit. It definitely doesn't seem to like when people pull out like that towards it, especially when there's not a lot of room, which I can kind of understand, but it is how humans drive, so hopefully version 12 will smooth these things over. Also has its right-hand turn signal on and incorrectly stops at this crosswalk, which makes the driver behind us think we're coming to a stop, and he tries to pass us for a second before we continue. Definitely still pretty robotic feeling through areas like this. And again, going over these speed bumps a little bit faster than I would be. You can see it slows down right towards the end, 8 or 9 miles an hour, but I would be going a little bit slower. There's also a stop written on the road up here. No actual stop sign, but there is a stop marking on the ground, which seems to recognize. You can actually see it visualized on the autopilot display as we run over it right here. And while it may not have been the smoothest and did manage to confuse a couple of humans around us, it did get us out of that parking lot all on its own. And actually going back and looking at the turn-by-turn directions it was displaying, I don't think that parking lot was mapped at all, so actually pretty well done. As we round this corner to get to the next stoplight, we have a car whose rear end is kind of hanging out into the road here, and situations like this is where older versions of the beta would have done some harsher inputs, kind of like coming to a complete stop until it could analyze the situation, but that was handled very smoothly, very similarly to how I would have done it. Also does a good job not creeping into this intersection and waiting for these pedestrians to cross first. Going to go ahead and fast forward until we get into the more narrow roads with more interesting situations, and I did want to point out that in celebration of version 12 acting a little more human-like, I've actually raised the speed offset of this full self-driving profile. So typically I force the car to obey the speed limit to a T, which of course is not how humans drive, at least in these areas, and I've increased that speed offset to make it flow a little bit better with traffic, which could be a bad thing in these narrow hills coming up. We'll have to see. We are approaching the end of our first navigation route, which was just a pin that I randomly dropped on the map. So I'm disengaging here so I can pull off to the side of the road, but something pretty interesting happens. As I manually pull towards the curb to get off the road, the car automatically steers away from the curb and sounds a take over immediately chime. I have never had the emergency auto steer engaged at such a low speed before. And in just a moment after setting in a new destination, I will go ahead and re-engage. I'm not counting disengagements that happened after we arrive at our destination just because the car isn't able to pull over on its own, but once version 12 arrives, I will start counting stuff like that as a disengagement. Can see some cars parked illegally up here. You are not allowed to park right next to a stop sign like that, but Beta doesn't seem to mind too much. Our navigation route has us going straight here, but interestingly, after it gets a good view of both sides, it just bails on this and turns on its left turn signal and heads left instead. It then immediately reroutes and has us taking the next right-hand turn. Not really sure why it did that or what happened. I went back and watched that a few times and I have no idea. I do appreciate how it's staying at a very slow speed through areas like this and not trying to get all the way up to the set speed. You can never be too cautious in areas like this because you never know when people are just going to run across the road like that lady just did. We have an approaching car ahead and also a pedestrian off to the side of the road. Everybody's waiting for us to go and it has to actually make a decision here, which it does and completes the maneuver successfully. You can see it has to get pretty dang close to these other cars here, but handled the whole thing surprisingly smoothly, I would say. Another interesting scenario up here, you can see this red car in front of us is already waiting at the intersection, and I thought it was because they wanted to travel down the same street we're on, but at some point they turn on their left turn signal and then start going into the intersection very late. They wave us through and autopilot goes. I don't think it was responding to that hand signal. Actually, I know for a fact it wasn't. But did successfully take the initiative and went for it when it was the other driver's turn, which I think was perfectly appropriate given the situation. Didn't do quite as well here though. You can see our left-hand turn signal comes on and the driver to our right starts to enter the intersection expecting to just follow us through there. But our turn signal was for this corner up here, which it absolutely did not need a turn signal for. It also turns on the right turn signal here for the right turn. Also having a bit of trouble figuring out where to stop at this stop sign. You can see it goes right past the stop line and goes all the way into the crosswalk. Our left-hand turn signal comes on again for this turn way up here. I swear the turn signals continue to be one of my absolute biggest complaints using the full self-driving beta. Sometimes I honestly feel like I'd prefer it to be a BMW driver and use no turn signals at all rather than doing the kind of stuff that it's doing and confusing everybody around it. Doing a nice job yielding for the oncoming vehicles. You can see it come to a nice smooth stop instead of slamming on the brakes like it used to do, so very nice. Maybe a little bit slow recovering here, but I'd rather go slow through areas like these than too quickly any day. Also a good time to ask you to get subscribed if you're not already. I don't think I'd be a real YouTuber if I didn't ask you at least one time in a video, so this is that time. Coming up here, we have a truck making a left turn onto the street we're on. The polite thing to do would have been pull behind the car to our right, which is illegally parked, by the way, but the beta does not do this. Still a pretty good amount of room for him to get by, though, so not a huge deal, and although it didn't do exactly what I would have done here, it does get through it all on its own. A pretty interesting bug with the visualizations coming up. You'll see some traffic cones ahead and it displays where it thinks they are in 3D space when some of them are actually in the middle of the road in front of us and it just runs right over them on the visualization. Probably a pretty good indication that we're not getting the entire story of what the car is deciding to do looking at just the visualizations. We have a roundabout ahead and you can see a stop sign to our left and a yield sign to our right. So technically we're supposed to yield here. The beta does come to a full stop before proceeding into the roundabout and I can definitely tell why that's a harder problem for a self-driving car. Took good initiative going into the roundabout, some good path planning around it, doesn't overreact to anything, and besides the wild turn signals, this was actually really well handled. One thing I'm actually most looking forward to with version 12 is hopefully some major improvements in the turn signal department. There are so many small nuances that you have to know about when to use them and when not to confuse other drivers. I'm really happy that it's going to be switched to neural networks that learn from humans. We are approaching a cyclist who's in the road and also going around a blind double line corner, so I was actually happy that it didn't pass here. You can see that car was coming, and if we would have tried to pass, it would have gotten into a really awkward situation. But as you can see, as it starts gaining visibility, it actually doesn't want to go past this cyclist at all. I think the reason for this is probably because we have a right turn coming up in the navigation route in a few hundred feet. And since there was nobody behind us, I did let the car just kind of do its own thing and take its own time here. But this would definitely be something that I would probably disengage for if there was somebody following behind, because they would have gotten extremely frustrated. Car also slows a little bit unnaturally here. I think it's detecting some kind of pinch point between the van to the left and the parked traffic to the right when it really didn't have to. These kind of situations seem to happen more frequently with Hardware 4, at least from my experience, and you'll see that more coming up shortly. After we make the right, we have a construction zone ahead with a worker holding a stop sign. You can see it correctly stops and visualizes the situation, but then treats this as a regular stop sign and starts to proceed, which does cause the first disengagement of the drive. You can see he does flip the sign around very shortly after, but the beta was proceeding while the stop sign was still out. So I'd rather disengage and let that data be sent back to Tesla. I did re-engage right after though, and although it's going a lot lower than the set speed I have, I still feel like it's going a little bit too quickly through that area when there's construction equipment around. Then as we round the corner, there is a truck that is just parked in the middle of the road with a very, very tiny gap. Typically, this is something the beta would try to fold its mirrors and fit through the gap, but it did not feel comfortable doing that in this situation, which did cause our second disengagement of the drive. And I did need to take over and manually fold the mirrors here. This was an extremely narrow gap even for me. This was quite a rough one. Unfortunately, at the same time that I clicked on the screen, I lost the visualizations recording, which unfortunately is not something that I took notice of until a little bit further into the drive. So although autopilot does drive just fine here with no disengagements, I do have to pull over shortly when I notice it's not working. And after getting everything set back up, we are back in action. And even when this screen that lets me direct record the visualizations can be a little finicky at times, I think you'll agree that the extra effort is worth it, and this is definitely a big step up compared to having a dash cam strapped to my instrument cluster like before. So shout out to Adam, whose Twitter handle is on the screen right now. He's the one who made this and is also working with me to make it more reliable on this car's new hardware. Another construction zone here. You can see this time the construction worker sign is in the downward position, so no need to actually come to a stop. Again, that's another pretty small nuance. It's probably pretty hard to train on its own, whether to actually stop for a stop sign or not, depending on the way it's being held by a human. Up here, the car detects what it thinks is a pinch point and slams on the brakes pretty hard. I've actually experienced this a lot more frequently on Hardware 4 than I ever did with Hardware 3. Maybe that's just a difference from going from ultrasonics to Tesla Vision alone, I'm not sure, but it is something that I've noticed. Up here is a very complex situation. You see the Model Y in front of us is trying to turn left, and there are two cars and a parked car in the way. He has nowhere to go, so starts backing up. The Honda CR-V starts pulling out and nearly hits us. I don't think she saw us at all. Autopilot folds the mirrors. We're all just stuck. What do you want me to do? It's not really possible to back up here because there's literally a gutter behind us and not room on the road for two cars to fit between each other. So I do just take over and then we get flipped the bird. The first time ever on these videos. Probably shouldn't be laughing like I am, but I do honestly find it pretty hilarious. I'm not sure exactly what that lady wanted us to do or what she thought she was going to accomplish by trying to force her way through there, since most cars are unable to fly quite yet. We did have a left turn back there, but since that obviously wasn't going to happen, I did disengage and made it go straight instead. The navigation route then does update, which has us taking a right turn here, followed by a pretty immediate U-turn in the road. It then folds the mirrors for seemingly no reason at all. I feel like the last encounter shook it up a little bit. You can see it displaying a creeping line that sits right beyond the parked cars to the right, which I feel was pretty appropriate, and then continues after the last car has passed. Now, after we make this right turn, we have an immediate U-turn to make, and it's in a part of the road where the legality is questionable at best. You can see that at least for a couple frames here, the path planner actually is considering doing a U-turn in the middle of this road. You can see though, as it becomes time to actually make that maneuver, it changes its mind and decides to try to find a different route instead. Which was definitely appreciated, by the way. I have no idea how that U-turn ended up in the navigation route at all, to be honest with you. After we make this left turn, we have an oncoming Model 3 approaching us, and in my opinion, Autopilot makes the wrong decision here. The best thing to do would be to pull over behind this SUV to the right, but it doesn't and just kind of gets stuck here. Very lucky for Autopilot that the driver in front of us was actually just pulling into their driveway, so not a disengagement here, but nearly. It does seem to be doing better and better at deciding whose right-of-way it is and between pinch points with oncoming cars and narrow areas, but there are still times it gets it wrong, like that example. And speaking of things it gets wrong, it comes to a full stop in the middle of the road here for seemingly no reason. There was no message on the screen or no reason to slow down really at all. Not really sure what happened there, but there was nobody behind us, so I just let it happen. Also a bit of awkward path planning. You can see as the car approaches from the left, it swings really far to the right and just doesn't really feel very natural through here. And another example of the car coming to a very hard stop for what it thinks is a pinch point that really wasn't. These are the kinds of situations that I think we're going to see the most improvement in with version 12. I have a feeling the car is going to behave a lot more naturally. And another example of the same kind of situation, but luckily this time the car slows down a little bit more gradually. We are approaching the end of our navigation route, and because this seemed like it was down somebody's private driveway, I went ahead and disengaged and pulled off to the side of the road to get a new navigation route in, but not going to add to the disengagement counter because I don't think it's the car's fault that I chose a poor navigation point. And once the new route is in, I go ahead and re-engage. And for as much crap as I'm giving Autopilot here for all the small mistakes it's making, credit where it's due, it is the only car even attempting to drive itself through streets like these. I would pay to see any car using LiDAR and pre-mapped routes to do the same. The car behaves a little bit overly cautious here as a lady from the left is walking her dog into the street and wanting to go behind us. You can see Autopilot just comes to a full stop in the middle of the road where it's kind of too late for us to give the right-of-way and we almost block their path. That's also something that seems to happen pretty frequently, but that also happened a lot with my Hardware 3 car as well, to be fair. Staying nice and patient at this intersection. There's cars way off to our left that it's waiting for, and then when it is safe to proceed, it does so. And also gets us into this left-hand turn lane to make this left-hand turn at the stop sign. Now there is a little bit of wonky behavior at this stop sign. You can see it appropriately wait for the first car to go through the intersection. The second car also runs the stop sign, no big deal. Then the car seems to get stuck a little bit. And what you can't see is there's a couple pedestrians approaching the crosswalk from our left-hand side. They just come into frame here. If it would have remained stopped there, it would have actually gotten stuck in the middle of that intersection. So I'm actually thankful that it moved up a little bit and got closer to that crosswalk before it stopped to wait. At least we're in a good spot right now where we're not really in anybody's way. But still, I probably would have preferred it to just be a little bit more assertive and take its right of way, because I think the pedestrians were kind of waiting for us to decide what to do while we were stuck in the middle of that intersection. I do find the car getting itself into a lot of situations where a tiny bit more assertiveness would go a long way. A good example here where we kind of pull off to the road for these two oncoming cars, but then they give us the right of way, and the beta has to be a little bit assertive and get itself through this situation. Luckily though, this time it does exactly that and is just assertive enough to get it through all on its own. Another similar situation up here where at first it slows down, but then go ahead and proceeds once it figures out that that truck was yielding for us. There's definitely a lot of little nuances interacting with other road users, especially when the roads are this tight. And approaching our last destination, unfortunately, it is right behind this construction zone, which Autopilot cannot figure out how to get through. Instead of rerouting, it just kind of stops here. This is the final disengagement and where I decided to call it for the video, but thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Your feedback is always super appreciated. And until next time, everybody.